Welcome back for another Wednesday Bible study. Acts chapter 12 this week is where we'll be focusing our attention, so you might want to open your Bibles there. Again, as always, we want to invite you to our in-person Wednesday Bible study. Every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Sundays we meet for a Bible study period at 10 a.m. and for a worship period at 11 a.m. We have a second worship period on Sundays in the evening time. Most Sundays it's at 6 p.m., but as it will be this coming Sunday, the last Sunday of the month of June, we meet at 2 p.m. The last Sunday of every month we meet at 2 because we have a meal together following the morning period of worship, and then we reconvene at 2 p.m. for our evening worship. So we'd love to have you come and be with us for any of those occasions. We're also looking forward to our homecoming and gospel meeting that we have at the end of July. We'll go ahead and plug that right here. At the last Sunday of July, we will have a homecoming. That'll be the 29th. And maybe the 30th. I'd have to look at those dates to be sure. But the last Sunday of July anyways, we'll have a homecoming day. And then that will also begin our annual gospel meeting that occurs at the same time. And we'll have a guest speaker in for that particular meeting, and we'd love to have you come and be with us on that Sunday for our homecoming day, and then also throughout the week through Wednesday for those gospel meetings as we come together to worship God on 6 occasions, 3 on Sunday and then 3 Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday nights. We'd love to have you come and be with us. Let's turn our attention to Acts chapter 12. We have a new chapter to be looking at. Of course, remember in the original writing of the book of Acts, this was like a letter or a treatise written unto Theopholis. And so in Luke's original writing, we didn't have a chapter breakdown. We didn't have verses inserted. And though we now have them, we do have to look at it as a whole or as a complete thought, because the information in chapter 12 is not independent of everything we've already looked at in the first 11 chapters, nor is it independent of what you'll look at from chapter 13 and forward. So as we look to chapter 12, we do have to ask the question in introducing it, what is the purpose of Luke including this information? What is the purpose of the content of Acts chapter 12 as Luke is trying to accomplish his intended purpose and stated purpose in writing unto Theophilus? And then, of course, the content. If you look at chapter 12, you have 3 distinct portions of the chapter. In the first 5 verses, you have the arrest or the death of James the apostle and the arrest of Peter. In verse number 6 through verse number 19, you have the miraculous release of Peter and his coming to the house of Mary. And then in the latter portion of the chapter, beginning at verse number 20 through verse number 25, you actually have the death of Herod. And so those are the 3 distinct portions of the chapter. And again, we ask the question, why is this information recorded? What does it have to do with Luke's purpose of the advancing kingdom? Obviously, the book of Luke focused on Jesus and his earthly ministry. He is the Messiah, but he's also part of humanity and thus is fully able to relate to the human condition. And Luke really brings that out, not just as a Jew, Jesus not just as a Jew, but as a human being. Then, as you come to Acts chapter 1, you begin to see the development of the kingdom. Knowing that Jesus had and fulfilled the earthly ministry that he did, what is the consequence? What is going to come out of that? And that is the kingdom. And so he's going to advance the idea of the kingdom and how it advanced in the world. So again, what does chapter 12 have to do with that? Well, first of all, I think it's important to consider what has already happened in the book of Acts. The church had its beginning in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, but not long after, you will see a persecution settle in against the apostles, particularly Peter and John, and then all of the apostles in chapter 5. And so from that point, from the beginning of the kingdom, and including up through and including chapter 12, there are 5 distinct occasions of persecution, or there are 5 what we might call attempts at persecuting the church so as to stop it. The 4 previous to chapter 12 were all inflicted by the Jews, because in chapter 4 and chapter 5 we have the persecution of the apostles by the leading people, Peter and John first, and then all the apostles in chapter 5. Those 2 occasions, of course, they connect together. Then in chapter 7, you have the persecution of Stephen. And that was more of the mob mentality. Yes, it was focused on by, or led by Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, but you have that attack against an individual, well-known, successful preacher. And it was actually the synagogue of the Libertines that led that persecution, but they were so effective that they got up the mob, as it were, to thrust themselves upon Stephen and stone him to death. So you had the Jewish leaders in chapters 4 and 5 in their 2 attempts, one in threatening, just words of threat. Then 2, they actually physically assaulted. They beat the apostles and then released them. Then you have the stoning of Stephen. And then that sparked a 4th attempt, and that was Paul, or the Saul of Tarsus, wreaking havoc on the church, leading a charge of arresting Christians, putting them on trial, and sentencing them for being Christians. And that actually went as far as Damascus, as we know from our study in Acts chapter 9. All of those, whether it be the Sanhedrin or the Jewish leadership, the chief priest and so forth, whether it be the synagogue of the Libertines, whether it be Saul of Tarsus, that was Jews persecuting the church. But now in chapter 12, we actually introduce a persecution that is not of Jewish origin necessarily. We have a Roman leader. We have one who is recognized and empowered by the Roman government that is now going to begin persecuting the church. And it's significant here that as we introduce Herod, you need to remember that as Acts chapter 11 ended, we were focused on what Paul and Barnabas were doing in Antioch and how they had been sent to Jerusalem, where James and Peter are going to be persecuted here. At the end of the chapter, you'll notice in verse 25 that Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem. We actually have in the content of chapter 12 what we might call a transition between the work of Peter and the work of Paul. Paul is singled out in as an apostle in chapter 11, with that being put in his hands, that gift or that monetary support for the people that were going through the famine, the dearth. And so it was sent by the hands of Paul and Barnabas. And then with verse 25, we're going to return back to Paul. What's significant here is we now have this uptick in persecution from the Roman government. And as that happens, you notice that there is unfettered activity by Herod. Notice he just kills James. No mention of trial, no mention of guilt or innocence. Just a matter that this Roman official could take a Jew, James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, and arbitrarily murder him, kill him, take his life. That was such that was political par for the course in that day. Not being a Roman citizen, they were of a lower class of people, and a Roman could do what he would with one like James, who was not a Roman citizen himself. And now that we have Roman persecution beginning, I know it's not going to be regarding Herod to the extent that it will be under Nero or even Caligula or others, even beyond that, even beyond the first century. It's still Roman persecution. And remember, the gospel is now ready to advance to the uttermost part of the earth, which was the Roman Empire. Interestingly enough, Saul of Tarsus, the fact that Saul was born in Tarsus, he was a freeborn citizen of Rome. There was a couple of different ways to attain your citizenship to Rome. One of them was to be of Rome, be of Italian descent, but you could also be born within a Roman city, thus freeborn as Paul was, or you could buy it at a great sum of money. Later on in the book of Acts, I believe it's in Acts chapter 16, it'll be noted, well, it may be later in the book, that there will be one that Paul will come in contact with that tells him he purchased it as at a large sum, but Saul was freeborn, which would even make him a higher degree of Roman citizenship than one who purchased it or who paid a great sum or a great price to secure it. The fact that Paul would be a Roman citizen would allow him certain concessions within the empire that Peter and James and John and the other Galilean men that were apostles would not have had. It's unlikely that Peter would have been able to do throughout the Roman Empire what the Apostle Paul was able to do, because Paul was able to capitalize upon that Roman citizenship to maintain his life. Even at times when the Jews would have sought to kill him, he was able, like in Acts 24, when Lysias, I believe it's Acts 24, maybe Acts 23, Acts 23, 26 through 33, he is going to be able to utilize that Roman citizenship, and Lysias is going to mention it when he saves him from the Jewish assault. And Lysias will say, hey, this was a Roman. When I found out he was a Roman, I made sure to protect him. I brought him away from the Jews. I secured him, and I've sent him unto you with a band of soldiers under the cloak of darkness in order for you to examine him. And I believe he was talking in the letter to Festus on that occasion. And we'll get to those parts of the book of Acts as we're going through. But that Roman citizenship was going to serve Paul well. So we actually have a bridge here. The content of Acts chapter 12 is that bridge where that persecution is now going to be elevated, not by the Jews, but by the Roman officials. And Paul, being the Roman citizen that he was, is going to have a more free course in order to spread the gospel among those Gentile nations and cities in the Roman Empire than would the others. And there's a significant statement here in verse number 17. After Peter had gone to the house of Mary and there was prayer made together, it simply says he departed and went into another place. We don't know where that place was. We don't know, we're not told exactly where it was. He does talk about Babylon in the book of 1 Peter, I believe it is, which we have no reason to think that was figurative necessarily. Peter was writing a rather straightforward, literal work, and so maybe he was over in that part just beyond the Euphrates, which would not necessarily have been under Roman rule, but Peter went to another place. And so we see that transition from where in the early part, Peter was the focal point of Luke as he worked among the Jews and even in the conversion of Cornelius. But now we're going to shift to this Roman citizen, the Apostle Paul, who is going to work throughout the Roman Empire among the Gentiles. We're told in Acts 9:15 that he was a chosen vessel, as Ananias is instructed by the Spirit to go teach Paul, because he's a chosen vessel to go to the Gentiles. Galatians chapter 1, verse 13 through 16, Paul talks about how God had separated him from his mother's womb. Very early on, it was a design of God that Paul would be that man who would carry the gospel to those heathen nations. And so this chapter serves as a transition. Now, there's also in this chapter the introduction of John, whose surname was Mark, in verse number 12. And in verse number 25, you'll notice that Paul and Barnabas, or Barnabas and Saul, are going to take John Mark with them. And so this chapter also serves to introduce this individual who is going to be an integral part of the storyline of the work that the Apostle Paul would do. And in fact, you'll notice that in the first missionary journey, when we develop chapter 13, John Mark goes with them. Now, once they come to Pergama, Pergus, he's going to go back, or Pamphylia, he's going to depart and return to Jerusalem. We don't know why he did that, but we know that whatever the reason was, Paul didn't agree with it, because in chapter 15, he and Barnabas have a rather significant contention about it, and they part ways. In one going to Cyprus, Barnabas goes back to the island of Cyprus and works, and then Paul takes up Silas, and they go into other parts, on into Greece, actually, where in the first missionary journey they worked in area of Galatia. And so Mark would be significant in all of that, and this chapter introduces him, kind of a sub-reason as to why the events of this chapter would be important. But then Mark would become profitable in 2 Timothy 4:11. Timothy would be told to bring John Mark because he was profitable to the ministry. So Mark would prove himself profitable. So that's why chapter 12 is significant here. And one thing we might point out about that of general proportions here, or applications, is the very nature of persecution. The events of chapter 12 occur about 11 years after the beginning of the church. And in that 11 years, we've already seen significant persecution of the church. And that wasn't surprising. Jesus had talked about it. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 16 through 42, there's a long section there. After Jesus has given the limited commission, he even talks about the Great Commission, but he expresses the fact that the world would hate those apostles, those disciples that he had. The world would hate them because they hated him first. And he warns them not to love life more than they love him, and be willing to confess Jesus before men. And even tells them how they would be brought before councils and before governors and before kings. And so Jesus had told them that persecution would come. Not surprising. John chapter 15, verse 18 through 20, if the world hates him, they're going to hate those who follow him. Same in John 16 and verse 2. So understand that the church is not going to be the object of delight in the minds of a lot of people. Don't be surprised that when you are what you are supposed to be in this world, that persecution is going to come. But now do remember this as well. In the face of persecution, there is reward. And so in Matthew chapter 5, in the Great Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus speaks the Beatitudes, blessed is he. In the very last of those Beatitudes, he said, blessed are the persecuted. And he says, great is their reward in heaven. So Jesus knew that persecution would come. He warns his disciples that persecution would come. And he tells them to delight, or to understand the blessedness of so being persecuted. It puts you in company with the prophets who served God under the Old Testament, and it brings great reward in heaven, which is ultimately what we're looking for. We're looking for that spiritual, eternal life with Him. And so just know that about persecution. Now, as we get into the content of chapter 12, there's a few other things that we need to understand, or we need to expose about the text. And one of them has to do with this Herod the king. It might do us well to give a little explanation as to who this is. In Scripture, you'll actually note that there are 5 different individuals that are referred to as Herod, or that would be classified as Herod. And the reason is, Herod is actually a family name or a family designation, particularly to these rulers, to those that would be in positions of power, political prominence, maybe kings, maybe governors, maybe tetrarch would be the word that you would see in the Scripture. It goes all the way back, first of all, to Matthew chapter 5. Now, we might mention that the Herods were actually Idumeans. There is a loose connection to Judaism. The Idumeans were the last of the Edomites. When Edom was destroyed by Babylon, they were actually absorbed. The people that were there, which would have been on the east side of the Jordan River, were actually absorbed into Israel. And when you see the term Idumean, we're talking about this group that were the last of the Edomites, or those that were left of Edom after they were destroyed by Babylon and incorporated into Judea and the Jewish economy. And so Herod has that loose connection, but he really isn't a Jew. He would maybe use that connection to his advantage if it advantaged him, but he really wasn't a Jew and had not great concern for the practices of the Jews. But in the first mention of Herod, you have Herod the Great. Now, he's the one who is king in this area of Palestine at the time of Jesus' birth. But remember, he died within the first couple of years of the birth of Jesus. He tried to kill Jesus, killing all the male babies up to the age of 2. They escape at the warning of God. Joseph and Mary and Jesus do in Matthew chapter 2. They are then told that Herod was dead and his son Archelaus ruled in his stead. When Herod the Great died, his dominion was divided into 4 parts, thus a tetrarchy. And Archelaus served as a tetrarch of Judea. So when they came back from Egypt, Joseph and Mary didn't settle in Judea, they settled in Galilee. So you have Herod the Great, who tried to kill Jesus at birth. You have his son Archelaus, who served as a tetrarch, ruling a 4th of that part. You have this Herod Antipas, who was also a son of Herod the Great. Herod the Great actually had 5 wives, or at least 5 women, from whom 7 sons were born. Archelaus being one that was born, that ruled, and Herod Antipas ruled in the area of Galilee. He had a tetrarchy that included Galilee, and Herod Antipas, this 3rd individual from that family that's mentioned in the Bible, was actually the one that slew John the Baptist. He was the one who had taken his brother Philip's wife, one of the other sons of Herod the Great, who had lived in Rome, and took his wife Herodias, and that Herod had killed John the Baptist, and was also the one that you see at the trial of Jesus. But after his death in 39 AD, you now have another Herod, and that's the one of this chapter, the 4th Herod, which would be Herod Agrippa the First. Now, Herod Agrippa and Herod Antipas were cousins, or rather, he was the nephew of Herod Antipas. So Herod Agrippa the first, the son of Aristobulus, the grandson of Herod the Great, the nephew of Herod Antipas. This particular one was educated in Rome. Not long after he was born, he was moved to Rome for education, I think in the school of Trachonitis. He was then acquainted and became a companion of Caligula, who would serve as emperor. Well, he is put into power in 37 AD in that region of Iturea and even part of Galilee. But then in AD 42, by it's either Galerius or Gaius, he was given Judea rather as part of his domain. And so from 42 to 44 AD, he is going to be king. And so that's the Herod that is here. Now his son, Herod Agrippa II, would be the fifth of those Herods that you read about in the Bible, and he's the one whom Paul said who said to Paul, "Almost thou persuadest me to become a Christian." And so Herod Agrippa the first here in Acts 12, and then Herod Agrippa the second in Acts 26, before whom Paul will give a defense. So 5 distinct Herods in the Scripture. None of them are notable men as far as being followers of Christ or being obedient unto God. Herod Agrippa II, before whom Paul stood, may have been the closest, as he said, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." But all of these others that we've mentioned, whether it be Herod the Great, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, or now Herod Agrippa, these were all immoral, wicked men that were put in places of prominence, and such is seen right here. So that gives us an understanding of who Herod was, and accounts for all the occasions when the name Herod is found in the Scriptures. A family name that was worn by all of these that served in capacities of kingship or tetrarchyship, which was a kind of a kingship over a certain region of the Roman Empire. But we might underscore the fact that they were Roman officials. Even though they were Idumean, even though they had that loose connection to the Jews, they were inserted into this place of power by the Romans. Thus, they were Roman officials. Now, we have to ask this question in verse 1. About that time, that is about the time that Paul and Barnabas were carrying that contribution to Jerusalem, Herod is going to stretch forth his hands to vex certain of the church. The stretching forth of the hand just indicates the power that he had. In this case, a political power that even has the potential for life and death. And he stretches forth his hand to vex certain of the church. And we might ask the question, well, why would Herod, because we're really not looking here at a recognition of understanding. In fact, this certain of the church being vexed with the killing of James, the brother of John, with a sword, it really doesn't explain why he did that. In fact, the arrest of Peter right after the death of James was incited by the fact that the Jews liked or found fondness with Herod for him having killed James the apostle. And so the killing of James the apostle was not necessarily at its root a reason to please the Jews or done to please the Jews, but certainly once he found out it did, he would then go after Peter too, one of the other significant individuals of the church. Now, here's what we know about Herod in vexing the church. It was purely political, and it was regarding personal prowess. What we learn about Herod from this text, even at the end of the chapter, is that he was a man that was full of pride, and he was a man who loved to be praised by men. And so, in this purely political act, for his own self-advancement, for men to praise him, to set well with the Jews. I mean, if you think about it, Herod is a Roman official. But as a Roman official, he desires that the Jews be pleased with him only to the extent that that would be beneficial to Herod in his position with Rome. If he can keep the Jews and their sentiment against Roman occupancy at a minimum, that is, keep the Jews from rising up and causing Rome a problem, being a thorn in the flesh of Rome, then Herod would be found very pleasing unto the Roman officials, and it would advance him with the Romans. And so by pleasing the Jews in persecuting certain of the church, he would be able to take their mind away from the Roman dominance, and he would keep them satisfied, keep them happy, so that they would not be creating insurrection. That's good for Herod. And that's partly why he would do this. We also know from the later portion of the chapter, as he loved the praise of men, once he finds out that it brings the lauding of the people to him, he's going to continue in it. He has no boundary as to what he'll do in order to be praised of men. Prideful people often act to assert their own greatness. And whether it be in killing James just because he could, or whether it be in presenting himself to the Jews as being likable, being pleasing to them, Herod's going to do what he can in order to get that praise from them. And he has no boundary from that standpoint. And that begs the question, really, of application. What keeps people from doing wrong? What is it that really keeps people from doing wrong? You know, I understand that in this nation, there's a great debate like concerning gun control and what causes these mass shootings that happen. We just had one Monday, and we've had several through the past decade or two. What prevents people from doing that, or what would it take to stop people from acting aggressively in that way? And really what happens, people misplace the reasoning. They don't understand what keeps people from doing wrong or what causes people to do right. And there's two things that I think we could really point to that stand out, that are applicable to you and I, especially even as it pertains to doing the will of God. One thing that prevents people from doing wrong is the fear of punishment. If the punishment for the wrongdoing is severe, it actually inhibits people from doing what is wrong. They don't want to be punished for their action. I know even as a child, this was a principle that I could understand. I grew up with two sisters. Now, sometimes I was the instigator, I was the one that did the wrong, and I got punished for it. But there were other times when my sisters may have been the individuals who did the wrong, and I was privy or was witness to the wrong they did and the punishment that they incurred. Thus, I knew that to act in the same way, to do the same thing, would then bring punishment upon me. And so it would prevent or it would hinder. Now, if the punishment does not detour the activity, then a lot of people will still do wrong. If there's no repercussion for wrongdoing, then wrong is still going to be perpetrated. So one of the things that we need to recognize is the consequence for wrongdoing. We may not be able to do anything about it in the world, and with even our legal system and our governments as they are established currently in our present society. However, when it comes to doing wrong as it pertains to God, when we understand what God has specified to be wrong, if we'll come to a recognition that there is stiff punishment for wrongdoing, he that doeth wrong shall receive again for the wrong that he hath done, Colossians 3:25, then it will be a deterrent against wrong behavior. If people understand that this is wrong, this activity is wrong, this action is wrong, these words are wrong, this thinking is wrong, and there is punishment that will be assessed for that wrongdoing, then it will deter the wrongdoing. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 7 through 9, when Paul said to those that were troubling, rest with us, and he talks about how the Lord will be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that know not God and that obey not the gospel of Jesus Christ. That promises, or that verifies, that assures us that there is going to be punishment for wrong. I think about what Hebrews chapter 10 says. When he says in verse number 31, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Read that the fact that our God is a consuming fire and understand that vengeance belongs to him. Just retribution for wrongdoing will be imposed by God. And so we need to recognize that God will punish wrong. Now, that may not always be immediate here in this life. It may not always be executed speedily in this life, but we understand there is retribution. There is consequence to sinful behavior. And when we stand with respect of that, we understand that we will be held accountable for our actions. It's going to cause us to at least think twice about engaging in it, and perhaps altogether relinquish the desire to do that which is wrong. On the other side of that, there ought to be the desire to do right. What would keep a man from doing wrong but to know what is right and a desire to do what is right? We are created in the image of God according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. And thus we are to acclimate ourselves, we are to assimilate ourselves to the very character of God. As God is a holy being, always right, always doing the right thing, always saying the right thing, in the time that is right, we need to be people striving to do what is right, say what is right, think what is right. Just like Paul said in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, think on these things. Well, he talks about things that are lovely, things that are just, things that are good report. It's right to do those things. Or Galatians chapter 5, when he says, the fruit of the Spirit is this: love, joy, peace, long-suffering, goodness, temperance, and so forth. When he says those are what the Spirit produces, he then says, against such there is no law, meaning these things are right. We should desire to be right because God is right. And what God has said is right, we should be seeking to implement in our lives. And when we desire that, we develop that desire to be right because it is right, it will be a deterrent from wrongdoing. I think about what was said of Jesus in Luke 2:52. We want to be right with God and with man. And in Luke 2:52, as it is describing the life of Jesus from the time of his 12-year-old self in Luke 2 and being found in the temple until his 30th year when he comes back on the scene, it's summed up in that verse. He grew in wisdom and in stature. That is, he developed cognitively, just like every other human being. He grew in wisdom, the application of knowledge. He grew in stature. So physically, he matured. Physically, he grew. And his bodily function matured, just as every one of us do. But he also grew in favor with God and man. That is our goal. We want to be right with God. We want to be right with our fellow man. Acts 2:47 speaks of the church daily praising God and having favor with all the people. We don't want to do wrong because we want to be right with God. We want to be right with our fellow man. We want to find favor with God. We want to find favor with our fellow man, or we should. That should be the disposition we develop. And when we allow the fruit of the Spirit to produce in our life, we're going to find that favor with God, and we're going to find that favor with man. But ultimately, we want to be right with God. Thus, we don't want to do wrong. We want to do what is right. And I think about what Paul said in Galatians 1:10, "For do I now persuade men or God? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Jesus Christ." What will deter a person from doing wrong? Some people, it simply has to be the fear of punishment because they do not fear God. But for those who fear God, what keeps a person from doing wrong would be the desire to be right with God. And Paul said, if I yet please men, I cannot be the servant of Christ. And so what Paul would do is act in his life, speak in his life, think in his life, so as to be found pleasing unto God. And that'll help prevent wrongdoing. I think about what Peter said in Acts 5:29, when he said, we ought to obey God rather than man. When man, in one of that second occasion of persecution against all the apostles on that occasion, wanted them not to speak in the name of Jesus anymore. And they simply said, we have to obey God, not man. What prevented the apostles from doing wrong in that occasion and forsaking Jesus and turning away from preaching about him? It was the desire to please God. It was the desire to be right with God. And so when we ask what keeps a person from doing wrong, it does have the element of the fear of punishment, but it also needs to incorporate the desire to do right. Herod had neither of those. When you look at Herod and what he did in vexing the church and what he did in killing James and then planning to do the same thing to Peter, Herod did not fear God. We know that because when he was called a god, he received those accolades and believed those accolades. And so he had no respect for God. He had no reverence for God. He only feared Rome. And so the only thing that he was going to do outside of self-indulgence was act so as to please Rome, because he would have feared repercussions from the emperor or from the other Roman officials higher than him. And his only standard for activity was the standard of his own strength and power. Some would call it the iron rule. Might makes right. I have the power to do it, so it's right for me to do. That was kind of the idea of the thieves in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Might makes right. They acted in such a way to think that because they had the power to do it, it was okay to do in robbing and beating that man and leaving him for dead. Well, Herod displays that same kind of understanding. He's a man full of pride, and with that pride, he sees no boundaries in accomplishing his own selfish purposes. Nothing there to really prevent him from doing wrong, because he did not fear God, and he believed that he had his standard of right was his power to do it. We need to be aware of those things and constantly set before us an understanding that we are answerable to God. If nothing else, remember this from 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse number 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account of the things done in the body, whether it be good or bad. So for every action that you engage in this life, you will stand before Jesus and account for it. That means there is a payday someday. There will be just retribution for the wrong that is done. We need to fear that punishment so as to refrain from wrong. And number two, we need to develop a sense of desiring to be right with God, something that Herod lacked, in order to refrain from wrong and do that which is right. It's not enough just to stay away from wrong. We actually have to do what is right. Now, I have a little bit of time remaining, so we'll go through a little more of the content here and give some explanation to a few things. Notice that James the Apostle was killed. He was killed by the sword, which means he was most likely beheaded, decapitated. That was one form of punishment. Remember, that's what Herod Antipas did to John the Baptist, so it was in use in Judea in that first century. Stoning was the preferred method, as the law of Moses gave it, but this was a Roman official enacting this, and so it was one form of punishment. James is martyred. Peter was not immediately executed, but the only reason he was not executed immediately is because of that desire for Herod to please the Jews. Had he executed him, he would have been doing it during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So when it says in verse 3, because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread, in parentheses, and when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. If Herod had killed Peter at that particular time, it would have been an offense to the Jews. You remember how when Jesus was crucified on that Friday morning after the Passover, they wanted him removed from the cross. They wanted those bodies, that death to be over with, because they didn't want it hanging there for the Sabbath. Well, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was going to commence at that point, and so they needed to remove that body. Well, Herod would, being familiar with customs of the Jews, having that loose connection to them, would have understood to have killed Peter at that time. It wouldn't have been advantageous to himself because the Jews were otherwise occupied, but it would also have been an offensive thing to carry out a capital punishment type scenario during that period of unleavened bread. So he's going to reserve that action until after the Feast of Unleavened Bread was over. And what we're talking about here is, remember, the Passover was instituted in Exodus chapter 12. On the 10th day of that month of Nisan or Abib, which was the first month of the calendar year, it would correspond to our time period of March and April, the spring of our year here in our calendar. And so they would, on the 10th day, shut up the lamb. On the 14th day of that month, they would kill the lamb. That was the Passover meal. On the 15th, they would commence the feast, the 7-day feast of unleavened bread that would continue till the 21st. All part of the commandment and the commemoration, the memorial that God had instituted from that event in Egypt when he killed the firstborn of the Egyptians, but passed over the firstborn of the Israelites, and it pushed Pharaoh over the edge. He thrust them out of Egypt, told them to leave, and the deliverance was underway. And so this Feast of Unleavened Bread is that 7-day feast that was instituted in connection with the Passover. So on the 14th, the Passover lamb is killed and eaten before the morning. And on the 15th, they begin this great feast of unleavened bread. And they continue that for 7 days, from the 15th to the 21st. Now, as Peter is put in prison, let me make one comment about this term Easter here. It's the only occasion that it is mentioned in the Scriptures. But I think it's essential that we comment on it right here for anyone who may be listening and not comprehending. By the time that the King James Version is translated, now I'm not sure how it is in all the other translations. I didn't take time to look it up in the American Standard or or any other translation like the New King James Version or others, or even the unreliable translations like the NIV or the New Revised Standard Version or the Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard Version. Some of those are unreliable. That's a discussion for another day. They're just not good translations because they mistranslate certain things. But anyway, the term Easter had developed in Christendom, and what we mean by that is within the context of New Testament concepts. Christendom in the sense of those who claim to follow Christ or those that base their religion upon the concept of Jesus. They're not saying that it's right, not saying that all of them are acceptable, because they're not, but within the aspect of Christendom, by 1611, when the King James Version is being translated, it was more understood or accepted in the concept of Easter as far as the time of year than the Passover. So when the translators use the term Easter, it's not altogether bad. It's just using a word for the same time period as the Passover, that they would put that connection together in the spring of the year, end of March, 1st of April kind of thing. But what it's talking about, as clearly defined in text, is the Passover of the Jews, not the concept of Easter as it is celebrated today. And really, while the term is used there, the whole concept of Easter in the religious world, within the idea of Christendom, is not actually a scriptural concept. This idea of the commemoration of Christ's burial on Good Friday, the Palm Sunday, the Lent, and leading up to the resurrection morning and all of that, it's not a biblical concept that is presented. There is no such celebration presented in the Scriptures. What is presented in the memorial of the burial and resurrection of Jesus is the Lord's Supper. Jesus commemorated it, or instituted it, the night he was betrayed in Matthew 26 with two emblems, the bread and the fruit of the vine. He took the bread, which would have been unleavened bread, and he took the cup, which would have been unfermented grape juice, because of the Passover meal that was being partaken of on that night. No leaven was to be in the household. Thus, it wasn't fermented, because the fermentation process demands yeast. And yeast, being leaven, would not have been suitable in the house, would have been a violation of the law. Thus, it was unfermented grape juice that was on the table. And so Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper that night. In Acts 20 and verse 7, we see the practice of it within the church. It was done on the first day of the week when the disciples came together. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul gives words pertaining to it, and he goes back to the night Jesus instituted it, and just as he instituted it, we ought to partake of it in memory of him. And of course, the apostolic example, the apostolic precedent found in Paul, in Troas, in Acts 20 and 7, was every first day of the week. Easter Sunday, as it comes in the religious world, is one Sunday a year, but there's 52 Sundays in a year, thus 52 first days of the week, 52 Lord's days, in which the death of Jesus is to be commemorated, not just one. And so we needed to talk about the term Easter here and why it was so translated, understanding that it is a reference to the Passover meal that the Jews were partaking of, not to the religious celebration that would take place among Christendom today. But then we have to point out what the Bible actually presents as the practice for the church. And it was to partake of that bread and fruit of the vine, that unleavened bread and that fruit of the vine, that unfermented grape juice, every first day of the week, showing forth the Lord's death till he come, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And so we address that matter. In these first 5 verses, we then have the vexation of Herod. We've talked about why he did it, with application to ourselves as to how to avoid doing wrong. We have addressed the fact that Peter was not immediately executed and why. We still have left the understanding that he was released from prison miraculously. We still have the events at the house of Mary, and we still have the demise of Herod to talk about. But we have some very meaningful application. We now know why this information is presented by Luke, and we also understand that there is application even to be made from that regarding persecution and the application of why a person does wrong and how then to avoid doing wrong. We have a couple other things to talk about. So next week we'll come back and we'll finish exposing the content of Acts chapter 12, and we'll have a couple more points of application to make even to ourselves. God bless you till next week as you seek to understand and apply God's word to your life.